In the brutal, unforgiving spring of 2021, when global supply chains abruptly seized up like a blown engine and nitrogen fertilizer prices spiked 300% in a single catastrophic month, the vast commercial corn belts of eastern Nebraska smelled of unburned diesel exhaust, sour damp earth, and rising silent panic. The 5,000-gallon bulk diesel tanks on the mega farms were running half empty, and the $250,000 autonomous GPS-guided tractors sat parked in towering metal pole barns. They were paralyzed, rendered entirely useless by chemical input costs that had suddenly, violently outpaced the future market value of the grain itself. The system was choking on its own complexity. On the rutted gravel lot of a community bank foreclosure auction in Otto County, a 42-year-old man named John Hayes stood near the rusted perimeter fence, his calloused hands shoved deep into the pockets of a faded, oil-stained Carhartt jacket. The wind cutting across the plains carried the biting chill of late March. At the front of the crowd, the bank's hired auctioneer, a heavy-set man sweating profusely through his insulated collar despite the freezing temperature, was rattling off bids in a desperate rapid-fire cadence, trying to liquidate the remnants of a failed 3,000-acre precision farming operation. Sitting neglected in the knee-high, frost-killed weeds at the very back of the lot was a 1968 Ford 5000 diesel tractor. It was a massive chunk of cold, Empire Blue Detroit iron, completely devoid of microprocessors, computer chips, or digital sensors. It weighed 5,200 pounds of raw cast steel and was slowly sinking into the spring mud. The paint was flaking off the engine block in jagged scabs. The Sims inline injection pump had been stripped of its lines. The mechanical steering linkage was completely sheared at the pitman arm, and the rear Goodyear Super Traction tires were sun-rotted down to the pale nylon casing threads. The auctioneer didn't even bother to give it an eloquent introduction. He called it Lot 42, scrap steel, non-operational, structural integrity unknown, sold for salvage weight. He started the bidding at a meager $100 and immediately looked toward the aggressive scrap metal brokers from Lincoln who had brought flatbed wreckers. Not one of them moved a muscle. The freight cost to drag a dead 3-ton block of immovable iron out of a muddy lot and haul it 40 miles up the interstate would consume the melt value before the truck even crossed the county line. The courtyard was dead silent. John Hayes casually raised one glove finger. He paid exactly $50 in crumpled, grease-smudged $10 bills that he pulled from a brass money clip. He received a handwritten yellow carbon copy receipt, folded it neatly into his breast pocket, and told the shivering bank deputy he'd have a manual hand-crank winch and a tilt-deck trailer out there by sunset. Standing just 15 feet away, leaning against the polished chrome grille of a brand-new $95,000 dual-axle Ford F350 Platinum was Dave. Dave was a neighboring operator who farmed 5,000 acres of genetically modified soybeans on variable-rate synthetic drip lines. He was a man who carried $2.4 million in rolling equipment debt to the farm credit banking system, plus an annual operating credit line of $800,000 just to purchase the anhydrous ammonia, patented Roundup herbicide, and chemically treated seeds his massive operation required to survive. Dave walked over, his expensive leather boots sinking slightly into the mud, kicked the rusted front rim of the paralyzed Ford tractor, and let out a dry, condescending laugh that sounded like a cracked exhaust manifold. "John," Dave said, shaking his head and wiping a speck of dust from his polarized sunglasses, "you've got a balloon payment of $12,000 due on your grandmother's back 40 tax note this coming December. You've got less than $1,000 left in your checking account at the local credit union. And you just blew $50 of it on a rusted-out, seized-up lawn ornament that couldn't pull a child's plastic wagon out of a dry sandbox." Dave was the ultimate industrial realist. He judged the viability of modern farming by gigabytes of soil data, satellite weather telemetry, and the gallons per minute output of massive chemical spray booms. His assessment of the 1968 Ford tractor was, in every measurable physical and economic metric of the 21st century, entirely correct. It just omitted one critical, invisible piece of information. A piece of information John Hayes had spent the previous 5 brutal Midwestern winters quietly verifying by the light of a kerosene lamp at his kitchen table. To understand why a man teetering on the absolute edge of financial default would buy a dead, heavy metal tractor, you have to understand the specific soil John inherited and the sacred knowledge buried within it. John's 80 acres wasn't prime, laser-leveled, highly prized river-bottom dirt. It was rolling, heavily compacted glacial till clay. It was ground so dense and stubborn that modern county agronomists had officially classified it as marginal grazing land, entirely unsuitable for commercial row crops. John couldn't afford to inject 200 a ton liquid nitrogen into the earth to force it to yield. He couldn't afford the proprietary, genetically locked GMO seeds that required expensive chemical subscription plans just to germinate. What John had, locked in a fireproof tin box beneath his bed, were his grandmother Eleanor's handwritten diaries from the 1934 Dust Bowl. The pages detailed an ancient, resilient, and highly complex symbiotic planting geometry known to indigenous cultures as the Three Sisters, specifically adapted heritage corn, deep-root climbing beans, and broadleaf winter squash, all grown simultaneously intermingled in the exact same furrow. The biological architecture was genius. The rhizobium bacteria in the root nodules of the beans pulled free invisible nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and fixed it deep into the heavy clay to feed the nitrogen-hungry corn. The thick, towering stalks of the corn provided a natural structural trellis for the beans to climb toward the sun, and the massive, sprawling leaves of the squash created a dense, living mulch canopy across the soil floor, trapping critical moisture during droughts and aggressively suffocating any competing weeds. But there was a massive mechanical problem that had caused industrial agriculture to abandon this method decades ago. You cannot plant 3 completely different seed species of 3 vastly different weights and diameters at 3 distinctly different depths in a single pass using a modern, computerized pneumatic vacuum planter designed to shoot uniform, identically coated seeds into sterile dirt at 10 miles per hour. To resurrect and scale a multi-species symbiotic ecosystem across 80 acres of heavy clay, John didn't need a $1 million software-guided robot. He needed raw mechanical torque, pure hydraulic lifting pressure, and an analog planting implement that literally did not exist in any commercial equipment catalog in the world. He had to build it himself. The mechanical resurrection of the Ford 5000 began on a freezing Tuesday morning in late March. John dragged the dead iron carcass into his unheated, drafty barn, smelling faintly of old mouse droppings and decayed alfalfa. He rigged a heavy-duty manual chainfall hoist to the laminated central oak beam, wrapped a logging chain around the engine block, and began the grueling teardown. Unlike modern tractors that will instantly shut down the engine and lock the transmission if a proprietary encrypted software sensor simply detects a non-authorized third-party fuel filter, the 1968 Ford 5000 is a masterpiece of unkillable, analog kinetic engineering. It requires 3 basic things to run: diesel fuel, intense mechanical compression, and a spark. That is it. When John unbolted the seized Sims injection pump, he didn't pack it in foam and ship it to an expensive authorized dealer in Denver for a $3,000 computer diagnostic check. He sat down at his grandfather's wooden workbench. He clamped a magnifying glass to a swivel arm, pulled out a precision micrometer, and completely disassembled the pump housing. The primary fuel plunger was heavily scored by decades of contaminated diesel. John walked over to the corner of the barn, powered up a heavy cast-iron 1970s South Bend metal lathe, and chucked a solid cylinder of C360 bearing-grade brass. The dark barn filled with the sharp, clean, metallic scent of cutting oil and hot brass as he engaged the carriage feed. He carefully machined a brand-new custom fuel plunger from scratch, turning the brass down pass by agonizing pass until the clearance tolerance matched the newly honed cylinder housing at exactly 4/1000 of an inch, thinner than a sheet of paper, thinner than a human hair. To fabricate the custom planter, he spent an entire week scavenging the forgotten scrapyards of Odo County. He found a heavy-duty, rust-pitted steel toolbar from a collapsed John Deere 7000 implement that had been abandoned in a ditch since 1994. Hauling it back to the barn, he fired up a 220-volt arc welder, striking the arc with heavy 7/18 welding rods, sending showers of blinding white sparks across the concrete floor. He meticulously cut, fabricated, and welded 3 separate analog seed hoppers onto a single reinforced row unit. To penetrate the dense, unplowed root mass of his heavy clay soil without relying on synthetic chemicals to burn down the cover crop, he fabricated a custom steel coulter blade with a severe 15-degree offset pitch, designed to slice the earth open like a surgical scalpel. But the true genius lay in the timing mechanism. To perfectly synchronize the seed drop of the corn, the beans, and the squash, he didn't use an expensive electronic microchip or a GPS timing monitor. He drove to a local scrapyard and bought a tangled bucket of rusted Huffy bicycle chains and old mechanical sprockets. He sat on the dirt floor with a piece of chalk, mathematically calculating the rotational circumference of the tractor's drive wheel against the gear ratios of the seed plates. He aligned the sprockets so that for every exact 10 inches the heavy iron wheel rolled across the earth, the mechanical chains would pull the seed plates to drop exactly 1 kernel of heritage corn, 1 climbing bean, and 1 squash seed, perfectly spaced into the cold soil. Here is the exact accounting of what the mechanical resurrection cost him in hard, unforgiving currency. The dead Ford 5000 tractor at the foreclosure auction, $50 flat. A rebuilt rotary fuel pump seal kit ordered from a vintage parts catalog, 1850. 4 gallons of off-road diesel, heavy-duty degreaser, and penetrant oil, 24/20. Scrap steel tubing, hardened cutting wheels, and a box of 70-18 welding rods, 85 drillers. 2 replacement high-pressure hydraulic hoses, crimped and clamped by hand, 32 insurers. Total absolute cash outlay to build a custom, zero-emission, multi-species regenerative planting rig, $209.70. The modern computerized single-species industrial equivalent from a specialized European manufacturer delivered to Omaha cost $140,000, required a $1,500 annual software subscription just to turn the monitors on, and could not plant 3 species at once. On a damp, overcast morning in mid-April, when the soil temperature finally hit 50 degrees, John pulled the resurrected Ford 5000 out of the dark barn and into the vast expanse of his heavy clay pasture. He sat on the cracked vinyl seat and engaged the heavy mechanical PTO clutch. The massive 4-cylinder diesel engine turned over, blew a thick, violent ring of black smoke out the vertical exhaust stack, caught its compression rhythm, and settled into a deep, guttural, bone-rattling thrum. He pulled the hydraulic lever, dropping the heavy steel custom planter into the unplowed dirt. The custom coulter blades sliced deeply into the earth. John didn't spray thousands of dollars of toxic weed killer. He didn't lay down miles of expensive synthetic nitrogen fertilizer strips. He just shifted the unsynchronized transmission into first gear, released the heavy clutch, and drove in slow, deliberate, perfectly straight lines. He listened to the hypnotic, rhythmic click-clack of the mechanical bicycle chains dropping seeds perfectly into the dark earth. Then came the sweltering, brutal summer of 2021, and the fragile mathematics of the global agricultural supply chain completely collapsed. A massive logistical bottleneck at the Port of Los Angeles, combined with a sudden, drastic spike in European natural gas prices, forced international urea plants to completely shut down production. In a matter of weeks, the wholesale price of liquid nitrogen skyrocketed from $400 a ton to an apocalyptic $1,500 a ton. The local agricultural co-ops began strictly rationing chemicals. Within 45 days, the landscape of Odo County turned into a massive, slow-motion disaster zone. Dave's 5,000 acres of genetically modified soybeans, completely stripped of their natural soil biology and entirely dependent on synthetic chemical IV drips to survive, began to severely yellow and stunt under the scorching August sun. His massive $250,000 high-clearance spray tractors sat idle and silent in their sheds, because running them across the dying fields burned more expensive diesel fuel than the stunted, failing crop was actually worth. The debt clock, however, kept ticking loudly. On John's 80 acres of marginal heavy clay, the biological system was aggressively feeding itself. The deep roots of the beans fixed the invisible atmospheric nitrogen. The massive, sprawling leaves of the squash choked out the invasive weeds and trapped the morning dew, keeping the soil cool and moist. The heritage corn towered an astonishing 9 feet high, the stalks thick and dark emerald green, completely impervious to the chemical shortages ravaging the valley. When the crisp autumn winds finally dried the stalks, John didn't harvest his crop and dump it into a bulk commodity elevator to be priced by a computerized trading algorithm in Chicago for pennies on the pound. He separated the harvest by hand and simple threshing. He fired up a restored 1920s Meadows granite stone mill in his barn and coal-milled the dense, flinty heirloom corn into ultra-premium, coarse-ground artisanal polenta and grits. He loaded the 50-pound canvas sacks into the bed of his old truck and sold the grits, along with the organic heirloom squash and dried beans, directly to a network of high-end, farm-to-table restaurant distributors in Omaha and Kansas City. His massive industrial neighbors were bleeding cash daily. John's total input costs for the entire season were $0 in synthetic fertilizer, $0 in proprietary patented seeds, $0 in toxic herbicides, and exactly 80 cents an hour for the red-dyed diesel fuel required to run the four-cylinder engine of the old 1968 Ford. In December of 2022, precisely 1 week before John Hayes's $12,000 balloon tax payment was finally due, the inevitable happened. Dave's primary 600-acre home tract, the absolute crown jewel of his operation, completely laser-leveled and heavily tiled, went up for emergency liquidation foreclosure on the freezing, snow-dusted concrete steps of the Odo County courthouse. It was a bitterly cold morning. The wind howled off the plains. 30 local farmers stood huddled in their heavy coats, their faces drawn tight, gray with the exhaustion and the crushing, suffocating anxiety of rising interest rates. The county bank officer stepped up to the podium and asked for opening bids. The soil profile of Dave's land was premium, deep black loam, but without affordable chemical fertilizer to pump into it. The highly leveraged local operators viewed it as a toxic financial liability. Nobody wanted to catch a falling knife. A slick, sharply dressed corporate land buyer representing a massive agricultural real estate investment trust, REIT, out of Chicago stood in the front row. He wore a tailored wool overcoat, completely out of place among the Carhartt and denim. He casually raised one leather-gloved finger. $2 million flat, the corporate buyer announced. His voice was smooth, bored, calculating. He was there to scoop up distressed prime American farmland for pennies on the dollar, waiting out the fertilizer crisis to flip it later. Dave stood near the brick pillar of the courthouse, staring blankly at his boots. He looked hollowed out, a man drowning in the unimaginable weight of $2.4 million of unpayable equipment debt. He had played by the rules of the system, and the system was currently devouring him alive. From the very back of the freezing, silent crowd, John Hayes stepped forward. He reached into his stained jacket, his knuckles still carrying the pale white scars from a rogue welding torch spark, and spoke in a clear, measured, unwavering voice that cut sharply through the wind. 2.2. The corporate buyer slowly turned around, his eyes scanning John's faded jacket, his grease-stained work boots, and his calloused hands. The buyer smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated urban contempt. 2.5. The corporate buyer snapped back instantly, trying to intimidate the local. He turned slightly toward John. "Buddy, you don't even look like you can afford the diesel to drive home, let alone the liquid nitrogen to spray that dirt. What exactly are you going to do with 600 acres of prime row crop ground in the middle of a global chemical shortage? Let it go back to wild prairie weeds?" John looked the corporate buyer dead in the eye. His expression was as hard and unyielding as the cast iron of his tractor block. "I'm going to let it breathe." A low murmur rippled aggressively through the crowd of desperate farmers. The corporate buyer shook his head in disgust, refusing to overpay for land that he believed was unfarmable without synthetic inputs. "Let the local fool bankrupt himself," he muttered to the bank officer. "I'm out. Going once, going twice. Sold to John Hayes for $2.5 million, the bank officer called out, his voice cracking slightly in the cold air. John walked calmly up to the clerk's folding table. He did not pull out a 30-year, adjustable-rate commercial mortgage pre-approval form. He did not hand over a leveraged operating loan document from the farm credit system. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a certified cashier's check drawn directly on the local Otto County Credit Union for $25,000 flat. It was the accumulated, unleveraged net cash profit of scaling a zero-input, high-yield biological regenerative ecosystem. A system built entirely on the back of a $50 piece of abandoned scrap iron, utilizing free atmospheric nitrogen, and sold to an exploding premium culinary market that aggressively valued deep nutritional density over sheer, flavorless industrial volume. He then handed the stunned clerk a second smaller check for exactly $12,000, wiping his grandmother's legacy tax debt off the county ledgers forever. The courthouse steps went completely, terrifyingly silent. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the heavy, vibrating, earth-shattering silence of 30 lifelong professional farmers, simultaneously realizing that everything they had been taught by the chemical salesmen, the equipment dealers, and the university agronomists about modern agriculture was a highly profitable, carefully constructed illusion designed to keep them trapped in a cycle of perpetual debt. They looked at the cashier's check. They looked at the corporate buyer walking away in defeat. They looked at John's scarred hands. Dave slowly walked over to John as the crowd parted. He didn't look angry. He didn't look bitter. He looked like a man who had just been pulled from the wreckage of a burning building and was breathing fresh air for the very first time in his life. He looked at the stamped cashier's receipt on the table, then looked out toward the bleak horizon where his own dead, yellowed soybean fields met the pale, freezing sky. "You grew a premium cash crop without a single drop of synthetic nitrogen," Dave whispered, his voice shaking with a raw, painful mixture of awe and grief. "You paid off the lien, and you bought my entire farm with cash, without signing a single bank loan." John looked at his neighbor. There was absolutely no triumph in his eyes, no ego, no arrogance. Just the quiet, unshakable steadiness of a man who knows how to mathematically calculate a gear ratio and turn a heavy wrench. The soil biology doesn't care about the Dow Jones Industrial Average, Dave, John said softly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. And iron rust doesn't charge you a variable interest rate. You didn't fail. You just forgot how to build and fix your own tools. A year later, in the spring of 2024, a slickly dressed executive from a massive multinational agricultural technology conglomerate drove a rented black SUV up John's gravel driveway. He sat uncomfortably on a wooden stool in John's barn, surrounded by the smell of oil and dirt, and offered John a highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar buyout for the exclusive patent rights to his analog multi-species planter design. There was only one catch. John had to agree to let them completely digitize the mechanical seed drops, encase the system in proprietary computer chips, and integrate it into their expensive cloud-based software ecosystem. John read the 50-page legal contract very carefully. Then he picked up a heavy black marker, signed his name across the glossy front cover page in massive diagonal letters, declined, and slid it back across the workbench. If I let you digitize the sprockets, I lock independent farmers out of their own right to repair their machines, John told the tech executive as he firmly walked him to his SUV. If I sell this design to your board of directors, I stop being a sovereign steward of my land and become an employee on my own farm. I already own the steel, the welder, and the knowledge. I don't need your cloud software to teach a seed how to grow in the dirt. John Hayes did not scale up into a corporation. He scaled deep into his community. He took the massive 600 acres of Dave's former, chemically burned ground, planted deep-rooted cover crops to break the hardpan, and began the slow process of healing the soil. But more importantly, he brought Dave and 5 other local bankrupt farming families into his drafty, unheated barn. He stood them in front of the 1970s South Bend metal lathe and handed them heavy leather work gloves and safety glasses. He taught them how to fabricate precise seed drop mechanisms out of abandoned bicycle chains. He taught them how to calculate offset angles for cutting coulters. He showed them that true, unyielding power in the modern world isn't found in possessing the latest microchip or having the highest credit limit. It's found in the fundamental mechanical tolerance of the machinery you can build with your own hands. Let me ask you a very serious question. When you look at a rusted, sunken, immobile 1968 Ford tractor sitting deep in the freezing mud at the back of a depressing bank auction in the rural Midwest, what exactly do you see? Most people see a $50 piece of worthless scrap iron and a massive logistical hauling problem. They see an obsolete analog relic from a bygone era that could never possibly compete with the high-speed, autonomous, software-driven efficiency of the modern tech-heavy agricultural complex. John Hayes saw the exact missing mechanical link in a highly advanced biological ecosystem. He saw a hydraulic pressure problem that could be easily solved with some scrap steel tubing, a cheap welder, and 3 quiet evenings of focused patience. He saw the profound difference between a rapidly depreciating, software-locked asset owned entirely by a massive banking institution and an unkillable, adaptable tool completely owned and mastered by the sovereign individual turning the wrench. $50 for a frozen block of Detroit iron, a mechanical rebel with a brass money clip, a 1970s lathe, and a handful of rusted bicycle chains. The machine that absolutely nobody wanted, placed into the deeply scarred hands of a man that society completely underestimated, until the exact day he walked up to a podium, wrote a cash check that wiped out a multi-million-dollar corporate loan, and legally bought back the future of an entire farming valley. In a modern world that is constantly aggressively screaming at you to continuously upgrade your lifestyle, subscribe to endless software platforms, borrow more money, and depend entirely on highly complex, fragile digital systems that you do not own and are legally forbidden to repair. Real resilience is not found in the size of your digital footprint or the limit of your credit card. It is found in the uncompromising ownership of your physical tools. It is found in the deep, obsessive mastery of your technical knowledge. And it is found in your unyielding ability to patiently create the highest possible market value from the smallest, most fiercely underestimated resources that the frantic crowd has left behind in the mud. If this story reminded you of the raw, undeniable power of getting your hands dirty, living intentionally, and building real, unshakable wealth and freedom on your own terms, hit the subscribe button right now. By joining this channel, you aren't just passively watching another video on the internet. You are actively joining a fiercely independent community of builders, creators, and sovereign thinkers who fundamentally believe that no global supply chain collapse, no sudden inflation spike, no market crash, and absolutely no tech corporation can ever take away a physical skill that you have painstakingly mastered with your own two hands. Leave a comment below right now. What is the one specific tool, the one forgotten skill, or the one abandoned idea in your life that everyone around you told you was completely obsolete, that you desperately need to dust off, repair, and rebuild this year? Don't wait for the system to save you. Let's build the foundation of true independence together. I'll see you in the next story.